As Thibault said, what I am going to talk about today are these digital competition regulations. Aspirationally, this is what my talk will cover. I'm going to refrain a little bit from going into great detail about the sort of content of these DCRs on the assumption that if you're here for this talk, you must have some idea about how they work and what they are. The DMA in particular is going to be our main example. So hopefully that'll shave off some of the time for the talk. What I really want to talk about, though, is in section 2, the real goals of digital competition regulation. I say the real goals because this is how I interpret what is really going on. It's not necessarily the stated goals, and that's, I think, one of the interesting things is to talk about what the nominal objectives are and what I think might really be going on. First of all, what are these things? The obvious progenitor is the Digital Markets Act, enacted in 2022 and came into force in 2024. We've seen a number of actions now under the law and a couple of decisions and disputes that have transpired, especially over the course of this year. There have been similar frameworks proposed in various countries and adopted already in a few. So in Germany, we have Article 19A of their competition law, which is essentially an ex-ante regulation of a certain sector, a certain set of companies, largely the same companies under the DMA. But in this case, it's part of their competition law. The ex-ante regulation is not a separate law, it's integrated into the competition law. In the UK, we have another variant, the Digital Markets Consumers and Competition Act, the DMCC, very similar to the DMA, but with some interesting distinctions that we'll talk about a little bit today. We also have, in Japan, they've enacted an ex-ante law applying only to aspects of smartphones, so app stores and operating systems, but primarily it's app stores that seem to be a concern there. It's, again, essentially, there are differences, but let's just say it's the DMA, but it only applies to smartphones. It doesn't apply more broadly like the DMA does. Turkey has implemented something called her e-commerce law that, as its name implies, is an ex-ante regulation that applies to e-commerce sites. There are lots of countries around the world considering implementing some version of a DMA or DMCC-like law. The ones that have progressed the farthest, I think, are Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, India, Australia, South Korea. Turkey is very likely to be adopted, probably no longer this year, probably next year, maybe this year. India is pretty likely to be adopted. South Korea is now on the rocks. Australia is likely to adopt something. Anyway, the point is that a bunch of countries around the world are looking at what's happening with the DMA in Europe and saying, hey, we want that too. I want to mention also just briefly these US proposals. None of these has been enacted. These have been proposed several times and never made it far enough through the legislative process to even be very close to being enacted. But these are bills that would amend US antitrust laws, so they would be incorporated into the competition laws, and they would adopt ex-ante regulatory schemes, much like the DMA. So there's a few differences between and among these ex-ante regulations, but a lot of commonalities as well. Again, I'm not going to go into huge detail on what these laws entail, but let me just give some outlines. There's a lot of commonality between them. I think what we lump into this category of digital competition regulation, these are laws that are targeting specific companies that they call gatekeepers, laws that apply these usually numerical thresholds to identify the companies that will be regulated under them. Numerical thresholds usually meaning either number of users or turnover, revenue. What triggers these laws tends to be the size of the company, its relevant, its size. These laws impose ex-ante prohibitions and obligations, in most cases entirely separately from competition analysis, and they don't imply the traditional tools of competition analysis. There isn't a market definition exercise, for example, unless you consider looking at the number of users or the size of revenue market definition. These are not effects-based laws, so to this second point about the ex-ante prohibitions and obligations, you're not looking at conduct and saying, how does this affect consumers and is it therefore anti-competitive? Rather, if you are designated as a gatekeeper under one of these laws, you, through a often convoluted process, you will have a set of obligations that you have to abide by and a set of things that are prohibited without reference to their actual competitive effects. I think what animates these laws, what sort of underlies them, at least nominally, is this assumption of a power imbalance. the underlying assumption here is that there are these companies. Apparently, they can be designated on the basis of how big they are. There are these companies that have too much power over the other companies that rely on them to do business. And in some cases, it's pretty explicit that the concern is with this sort of power imbalance. So they're regulations, but they're not exactly sectoral regulations like telecom regulations like we think about, not least because it's really problematic to lump together Apple iOS and Booking into a single sector. They have virtually nothing in common with each other, the way that, say, all telecom operators do have a lot of commonality with each other. So I don't think this is really sectoral regulation, but it's also not traditional competition law. And I think it's worth talking about a few of the differences. First of all, these laws, it's different in different countries, but let's look at the DMA for a minute. The DMA explicitly disavows competition law goals to the extent that competition law goals tend to be promotion of a competitive process or the protection of consumer welfare. Instead, the goals are fairness and contestability. That's pretty common under these laws, although I will say that in some of the ones that have been proposed, they're less explicitly disavowing competition law goals. They may use terms like competitive process and may even refer to consumers, but that's not really their case focus. Thanks. I think I'm going to talk at some length today, maybe what I think is the most interesting part of my talk. I promise we'll get to an interesting part there. It is about contestability, which sounds like a competition law goal, but I think the way that's implemented under digital competition regulations is very different from the competition law conception of contestability. I think, let me draw one point out of this, whereas the last one, burden of proof is reversed. I think that's something interesting to talk about and think about with respect to how these laws relate to competition law. So in the German case, for example, where the ex-ante regulation is incorporated into the competition law, the way it operates essentially is to allow, once you've designated your target company as one of these gatekeepers, basically the procedural rules under the German competition law that would put the burden of proof on the plaintiff and that would require proof of harm, injury, those you don't have to do anymore. You basically get exempted from those and you shift the burden of proof. Once you're designated a gatekeeper under the German law, it then is incumbent on the defendant to prove that it's not. But even here, there are changes to the law. You don't get to prove that your conduct doesn't have any competitive effect. I mean, you could try to prove that you shouldn't be designated a gatekeeper. In the case of the DCRs that have been integrated into competition laws, one of the primary things they do is reverse the burden of proof and change what it is you can or have to prove as a defendant, get out from under these laws. With respect to DMA and other DCRs that are separate from competition law, you can't even really say they shift the burden of proof. There is no allowed, in the case of the DMA, there is no opportunity for defendants. They don't even get a tough burden of demonstrating that their conduct doesn't have any competitive effect. That's simply assumed, and where you're negotiating is, again, like in the German case, whether you should be designated in the first place, but then it's just fighting over exactly which obligations and prohibitions are going to apply to you. Okay. This is a list of what I see as being important competition law principles. You could come up with a different list. Actually, I've given this talk before, and since then I've edited this list, and I'm sure if I do it again, I'll probably edit it, but this is close enough for now. Important defining principles of traditional competition law are that it's aimed at conduct that restricts competition. It's an effects-based analysis. Requires an assessment of market power. We don't apply competition law, even if you're doing something that could be labeled anti-competitive, or that looks like it might be anti-competitive, if it were being done by a dominant firm. If you're not a dominant firm, antitrust doesn't usually apply to you. There are obviously some exceptions there per se and by object prohibitions under US and EU law, but for the most part, this is the way it works. Enforcement under traditional competition law is usually, again, not everywhere, on a sort of case-by-case basis. It requires trading evidence and a fact finder who decides which evidence is more convincing, and all of that is geared toward proving whether or not there are economic effects of the conduct, and it should be prohibitive. I think also really importantly is that everywhere, really, where competition laws have been implemented, they reflect some version of an error cost framework. There is a sense that it matters that we might be getting it wrong, and that sometimes we will refrain from enforcing the law because we're unsure about what the effects are, and we could actually be prohibiting pro-competitive conduct, and we don't want to over-enforce the law. By the same token, we don't want to under-enforce the law, and also we care about the cost of the process. Probably people would say in the US, there's a much stronger tradition of the error cost framework leading to the restraining the enforcement of antitrust laws than in Europe, but even in Europe, there's certainly an error cost dynamic to the law. All right, contrast that with digital competition regulation principles. As I mentioned, this should be reversed. You are captured under the law not because you had market power, but because you meet a certain set of designation criteria. These may or may not have any relationship to market power. It is simply not the case that size is correlated with market power. Sometimes it is, but not always. But remember, the designation, a quantitative designation criteria under these digital competition regulations is largely a measure of size. There are also some qualitative designation criteria I'll talk about in a little bit. They attach to, or they prohibit conduct irrespective of economic effects. We'll talk a little bit about what exactly these laws prohibit and what sort of obligations they impose, but they're not assessing whether these things should be prohibited on the basis of whether the conduct has any competitive effect. And the obligations that may be imposed on companies that come under DCRs are imposed irrespective of their competitive effect, particularly on consumers. They are effectively per se rules with only very limited exceptions. Unlike traditional competition law, as I said, the goals here they have their genesis in competition law. There's certainly an affinity between DCRs, and there's a reason I call them digital competition regulations. They obviously have a competition-related heritage to them, but they certainly go beyond what traditional competition law would, focusing on, they mentioned spirit of power, but also fairness, implementing social goals and the like. What I want to convey here is that there's an affinity, there's a heritage connecting these principles with the traditional competition law principles, but there are obviously very clear differences. And I think the way I would characterize it is that they opportunistically use competition law when it serves their purposes and jettison it when it doesn't. So in particular, the underlying approach to these laws is very structural. They harken back to the bad old days of competition law when the structure, conduct, performance paradigm was paramount. The paradigm was paramount. They are inherently structural. They care about what the market looks like, and they think we're going to intervene in a way that restructures the market in a way that is more consonant with the principles we're trying to enforce under these laws. They pick and choose other aspects of competition law that sort of conform with their vision and discard others that don't, because competition law has obviously evolved beyond the structure, conduct, performance paradigm. And yet there are aspects of competition law that do look like they care about the structure of markets, and proponents of digital competition regulations will point to those to say, no, look, there's a lot of alignment here. An interesting example is the question of fairness. Fairness is, I think it's hard to say that fairness has ever been an objective of traditional competition law, but you actually see proponents of DCRs today claiming that's always been the objective of competition law. Andreas Mundt in Germany has said that's always been the objective of competition law in Germany. The Indian Competition Commission has said that fairness and contestability have always been the objectives of competition law. We can have a debate about that, largely because fairness is such an ambiguous term. Who knows what it means exactly? You could describe what competition law is doing as creating a fair market. It's just that your definition of fair would probably be different than the definition of fair under DCRs. But I do think it's quite interesting that proponents of DCRs, very explicitly based on promoting notions of fairness and contestability, again, try to claim this heritage with competition law by saying, oh, look, competition law has always cared about these things too. Ultimately, I think you can say that DCRs are a more stringent, more targeted, more enforcer-friendly form of competition regulation, intended to restructure markets or certain products or certain companies. And that's a really important difference. Unlike antitrust law, which doesn't have preconceived notions anymore of what a competitive market looks like, It's concerned with the effects of conduct. It doesn't assume that you have to have a certain structure to the market to achieve pro-competitive effects. DCRs are very different. They assume a market should look sort of predetermined way, and if it doesn't look that way, we impose obligations and prohibitions to push it in that direction. Okay, so here's what I think are the real goals of these digital competition regulations. I think they are aiming at redistributing rents among firms, at facilitating rivals, including less efficient competitors, essentially without relevance, without looking at the competitiveness of the rivals. And I think they are actually aiming at leveling down gatekeepers. It's not just building up competitors, it's tearing down successful firms in the market. Most importantly, perhaps, consumer welfare is a subsidiary consideration. Now, you see proponents of DCRs talking about consumer benefits. I've looked at a bunch of the speeches over the years. They usually mention consumers, but it's quite notable that in the actual implementation, none of the effect on consumers matters at all for how the laws are being implemented. Consumer welfare, if it's considered at all, is a subsidiary concern. It is more explicitly a part of the DMCC, for example. There's language by virtue of referring to other parts of UK law, a protection of consumers element is present in the DMCC. But again, it's a subsidiary consideration. Okay, so let's talk about redistributing rents. And really, I think this goes to the question of fairness. The central premise in these laws, and again, this is sometimes very explicit in the preambles and often in the speeches and conversations around these laws. The central premise is that there are power asymmetries between platforms and other stakeholders, and that these produce inherently unfair outcomes. Okay, so what does that mean, unfair? I think that it's really hard to see that as anything other than too much profit. Now, I shouldn't say it's hard to see it as that. Because it's so poorly defined, enforcers can make it into anything they want. But for the most part, because it's easy to measure and because it's what competitors care about, fairness is going to come down to how much money does the gatekeeper earn and how much money do the complementary companies, the ear gatekeeper, earn. One reason I know that it's such an ambiguous term, before I talk more about the money part, is that it's really interesting that fairness isn't defined, say, in the DMA. Unfairness is defined. Now, unfairness is defined as this imbalance. That's what you do when you don't really know what fairness is. It's really hard to define fairness, so you define unfairness. And of course, there's always some imbalance somewhere. If you really had a concept of what fairness was, it would be like a knife edge that it would be teetering on, and there would be a near infinite range of relationships between companies that could be considered imbalanced, and only some very narrow band that would be considered balanced, right? So it's hard to define what that balance looks like, so we just say imbalanced. But that means all a competitor has to do is say, I feel like I'm being, like there's a power imbalance, and you can tell there's a power imbalance because I'm forced to sign a contract that has terms that I wouldn't implement if I were free to implement whatever terms of a contract I wanted. That sounds like imbalance to me. No, that sounds like traditional controversial relationships. But I think that is exactly the situation that we're in with laws that implement fairness by defining it in terms of what's unfair. So the point about profits, I think you could replace the words disproportionate advantage in this definition with disproportionate share of the profits, and you get to what is really, at least as a practical matter, going on under these laws. What else is fairness supposed to mean but how revenues are distributed? It could mean other things in other contexts, but these are basic commercial relationships. No one really cares about anything other than how much revenue they're earning. There's a political dimension to all laws, of course, but there's a particularly interesting political dimension to these laws. Digital giants, right there, there's a normative claim being made. Digital, I think, because giants is a pejorative term. People call me giant all the time, and I know they don't mean it nicely. Digital giants are not just nice companies with whom we need to cooperate. They are rivals of the states that do not respect our economic rules, which must therefore be regulated. This is from Bruno Le Maire, who was at the time France's Minister of the Economy. I think it's really interesting that states see these companies as sort of competitors, not just in the economic sphere, but in the political sphere. I think the sense of taking these companies down a peg, for the most part, it's aimed at propping up other companies, competitors or complementary companies, companies it's not escaped the legislators who've enacted these laws and the policymakers that there's also a power relationship between some of these large companies and the state itself. And the state doesn't like to have competition. It likes a monopoly on its use of force and various other things. And I think it's may not be the animating principle behind these laws, but it's certainly seen as a nice side benefit in some countries. I want to talk, this is sort of an illustration of why I think the root of this is how profits are being distributed and how that's played out under the DMA, for example. I'm going to try to do this really quickly so you can read the basic background here. Some of you may be familiar with this, that under the DMA, companies have to propose how they're going to comply with the DMA. Apple, with respect to its App Store, put in this proposal that would have reduced its commission from 30% to 10 to 17%. Almost no one pays the 30% commission. Only the largest developers pay the actual 30% commission, which, by the way, is itself a nice point to make. The really small companies, the companies that would have the biggest power imbalance with a company like Apple, are rarely, if ever, paying this 30% fee that is the source of the alleged problem with how Apple implements its App Store. They actually, in some cases, pay nothing. If you're a small enough developer, nothing beyond a pretty nominal upfront fee. It's interesting that the power imbalance is being corrected between Apple and the largest of the companies, smaller than Apple, but the largest of the companies that are dependent on Apple, the developer companies, rather than the smallest ones. So Apple comes up with its compliance plan, knocking the 30% fee down to 10 to 17%, but imposing this core technology fee of 50 euro cents per first annual install over $1 million. That's a good indicator of the size difference, by the way. If like the vast majority of developers don't have 1 million users. So even this core technology fee only applies if you're big enough to have 1 million. Sorry, that's not entirely true. 1 million new users a year. Sorry. The reaction to Apple's proposal, which certainly was a considerable reduction from the 30% across the board fee that it was taking, was that this is malicious compliance that spits in the face of open markets, fair competition, and the European Commission. That from a developer, of course. Not that I have anything against developers, just this one in particular. The point is that it seems pretty obvious. The way the discussions ensued after this proposal was, the assumption was that Apple was going to get less of the profits than they would get under their proposed compliance plan. And that was not acceptable. They needed to get even less of the profits than their proposal allowed. So 10 to 17%, let's just pretend like it's just, that's what they get, 10 to 17% of every transaction that happens on these apps. That's too much. They need to only get, we don't know what they need to get, but something less than 10 to 17%. The fight was over the amount, the dollar amounts. And that's not surprising, both because that's what's easily quantifiable, but also because if you're in business, that's mostly what you care about at the end of the day. How much that? 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay. The first thing was redistributing res, I think, is the actual goals of the DCRs. The second is facilitating rivals and this notion of contestability. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to go into what I thought was the most important part of the talk. He's going to have to cut that out. No, I'll do it right now, and then I'll probably have to end. Okay. Facilitating rivals and promoting contestability. Now, as I said, what digital competition regulations mean by contestability is, I think, pretty different than the traditional economic conception of contestability. Here, the intention is clearly to change the structure of the markets by somehow ensuring that more competitors enter into the market. As I said, it does sound like, and superficially the objective here is to facilitate competitors, which is a way of facilitating competition. But I don't think that it matters to digital competition regulations whether the competitors who are being facilitated are particularly competitive competitors. It's just we need a certain number of them, and we need to have consumers switch to them to some degree. It's definitely about not just ensuring that competitors can enter the market, but ensuring that they actually do. And that's where there's a huge distinction between the economic conception of contestability as created by Baumol, Panzer, and Willig, and the conception that's being implemented under digital competition regulations. The classical theory of contestability is that as long as entry and exit are possible in a market, even if you have a very small number of firms present at this current snapshot of what the market looks like, the firm may still behave as if it's in a perfectly competitive market because there's the threat of entry by new firms. Even in some cases, a market with a single firm in it can act like it's a competitive market because the market is contestable. And it knows that if it starts to act like a monopolist, all of a sudden there'll be new entrants and they'll face competition. Importantly, under the traditional theory of contestability, it's a dynamic process. So having contestability means that the threat of entry constrains the competitors, but being able to enter means sometimes firms will in fact enter. It means that if those firms that enter, that think they're able to compete with the incumbent, aren't actually able to compete, they're somewhat less efficient, or scale economies mean that, well, essentially they can't compete, they're less efficient, they exit the market as well. Exit is an important part of the traditional theory of contestability. And the recognition that it's an ongoing developing process, at any point in time, the snapshot you take of the market may be at a moment in which a bunch of firms have entered and they're actually going to exit soon, or it may be one in which firms have already exited because they couldn't compete with the incumbent. And by the way, prices are going to fluctuate as well. During those periods where you have some of the entrants in the market, prices might be lower. Where they've left, prices might be slightly higher. They're always going to converge toward the competitive level under this theory. But at any specific point in time, they may not have converged yet. So what you have under the traditional theory is that any particular snapshot of the market at any point in time doesn't have to be consistent with what a perfectly competitive market would look like for us to believe that these are in fact competitive markets. Honestly, that's true in perfectly competitive markets as well. There are extra exogenous reasons why firms might go out of business, for example. And even though no one thinks the market is uncompetitive, sometimes it'll have more competitors, sometimes it'll have fewer. That's essentially what we're saying here. The problem is that under the DCR version of these, of contestability, the requirement is that firms actually is, and the assumption is that the number of firms in the market at the time we've taken our snapshot that says, here we have a gatekeeper firm and not enough competition, that is inherently uncompetitive. And the only way we can measure whether we've moved from uncompetitive to competitive is by looking at how many firms enter the market. I think we don't know exactly how it's going to play out into the DMA yet, but it's pretty clear that what's going to happen is unless users start switching to these new competitive entrants, the regulators can and will deem the market as being not sufficiently contestable here. So even if what's happening is the new entrants come into the market, they're just not as appealing as the incumbents and consumers don't switch to them in droves, it's under these digital competition regulations, the enforcers can say, this is still a not sufficiently contestable market. We have to do something else. The reason we know that is because users are still using these evil, horrible incumbents. They wouldn't do that if there was contestability. That assumes that the only reason these firms are attracted to consumers is because they have monopoly power. But of course, it could be that they're actually just more attractive firms, right? That's totally inconsistent with the classical conception of contestability. And I think it is consistent, though, with the notion that the real objective here is dissipation of strength of the incumbent firms and facilitating rival firms, regardless of their competitiveness. And of course, very consistent with the idea that what matters most is exactly what the structure of these markets look like, not whether they're producing competitive outcomes or not. The last element of the three things that I think are really going on with DCRs is this notion of leveling down gatekeepers. And so that's inherent in what I've been talking about in a way. If you're facilitating rivals, you're almost of necessity, at least constraining the incumbents. And I think it's more than that. I think it's really an intentional part of these laws. There are some aspects of these laws as they've been implemented or proposed into the e-commerce law that's been enacted in Turkey. Being considered a gatekeeper under the law means that you can't engage in merger activity for a certain long period of time, for example. Basically saying we're going to ensure that these firms get no larger, even if the market expands, and to be competitive, the firm needs to engage in some mergers. We're actually going to say that if you're one of these gatekeepers, you can't. And there are elements of these laws that are clearly aimed, again, at constraining the gatekeepers. I said there were three things I think are really going on: redistributing rents, facilitating competitors, and leveling down gatekeepers. And I think the most important consequence of that is the lack of thought about consumer welfare as a component of these laws. Now, again, as I said, they often use the language of consumer welfare, but I think that their actual structure and the actual way they've been enforced betrays that. First of all, there's no consumer harm requirement for liability. So right off the bat, if these laws are acting to the benefit or are inuring to the benefit of consumers, it's happening indirectly because we're not measuring whether imposition of this obligation has led to benefits for consumers. We're just assuming in some cases that it is. Nominally, we're assuming that it is. So at the very best, it's indirect. And I think economic literature has made very clear that many of these imposed obligations and prohibitions are unlikely to actually inure to the benefit of consumers. So take one example. In every one of these laws, there's a prohibition or a significant constraint on self-preferencing, essentially a constraint on vertical integration. The economic literature is very clear that self-preferencing in most contexts benefits consumers. There are certainly times when it doesn't. But the overwhelming evidence is that this is good for consumers. There's also economic evidence that it's actually good for competitors too. It's astounding. Some of that evidence comes directly from digital ecosystems. For example, a study that looked at Facebook buying Instagram showed that it benefited competing photo sharing apps. You can construct in your head a reason why it might do that. It's almost like marketing for a whole industry. All of a sudden, Facebook implements Instagram. Hey, I didn't know photo sharing was a thing. That's cool. Oh, look at these other apps that are doing photo sharing. So empirically, it turns out that you might think that these apps would be horribly hurt by the implementation of Instagram. And at least at the time the study was done, maybe it's changed. Totally dynamic markets, of course. At least at the time the study was done, they were actually benefiting from it. Okay, the real point here is that whether they're benefiting or not, traditionally we think that consumers do benefit from this sort of behavior. Again, not always. And yet the constraints that are being imposed are constraining that kind of conduct. Similarly, the lack of efficiencies defenses basically says, even if you wanted to go to the enforcers and say, look, I understand in most cases this conduct is bad for consumers, but look, here is very strong evidence that the way we're implementing it is actually good for consumers. There's an efficiency reason behind this. You're not allowed to do that under DCRs. Under the DMA, there is no opportunity to mount an efficiencies defense. In some of the proposals in some other countries, there might be a way to do that. They're still being worked out. There's language that could be, in Brazil, for example, there's language in their proposed bill that sounds like it could allow for gatekeepers to raise efficiencies related counter arguments, but we'll have to see how it's implemented. It's not clear that would be the case. I guess the point is this. As I said, some of the things that are being implemented under these laws in some circumstances could very well promote competition. They don't across the board. There is no reason to think they do across the board. And there's no reason to think that any particular implementation, because it's not done in a contestable setting in which the defendants can raise efficiency defenses, there's no reason to think that they are necessarily promoting good things. But even if they are, there are costs to the way these laws work, these among them, and these are, I think, largely systematically disregarded in the implementation of these laws. So it's not to say that they're necessarily harmful. It's to say that they're not appropriately assessing whether they're harmful or not. And one of the most important things that's lacking for most of these laws, this is why I think this sort of understanding is so important as these laws are being considered around the world, is they have very limited ability to alter a determination that's been made. So if you think of these as regulation, the best way to do regulation is we regulate, we see what the consequences are, and if it doesn't work out the way we wanted it to, we change the regulation, or we decide this firm doesn't need to be regulated anymore. Not that regulators do that very often, but that is the best way to do it. That's exactly what you want to do. Sometimes regulations come with sunset clauses, by the way. So a new kind of regulation is implemented, and it is sunsetted after 5 years or something unless the legislature renews it, precisely because we don't know exactly what the effects will be. And if it turns out to be bad, we want to get rid of that. There is no mechanism for that under most of these laws. There's arguably a little bit of one under the UK, under the DMCC. I don't think there's anything under DMA that really says the commission has to go back and look at its prior designation determinations and the obligations and prohibitions that have been imposed, assess the effect on consumers, or even assess the effect on the structure of the market and determine whether or not they'd actually led to an increase in competition or benefits for consumers. And if they haven't, those designation obligation determinations are reversed. I don't think there's any mechanism for that. And that's a real shame because, of course, these markets change all the time. Even if you were right, even if the DMA was right to impose the obligations it has or is doing on Apple and Google and Meta right now, it may not be in 5 years. And there should be a mechanism by which we can assess that. It's, as I said, entirely or largely missing from these laws. And that's a real missed opportunity because even if I'm wrong, I'm certainly right that these laws could be bad, and we should at least have a mechanism for assessing that ex post. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You have about 10 minutes for questions. I have burning question, but I will keep it for later.
Give the floor to Thibault in the room.
Just one question about the